So I'll never forget the day that I was talking to my little 3-year-old girl. And just so you'll know, I've got 6 kids. My 5 oldest are boys, and my youngest is a girl. And so she'd been raised with a bunch of boys, right? And I'll never forget when I was talking to her and she screamed at me. She's about 3 years old or so. And I said, "You know what? Don't you scream at me, little girl." And she turned to me and she said, "Well, don't you scream at me, Big Daddy." And I'll never forget that because it kind of stopped me cold in my tracks. And I was thinking, do I scream at her? She's my only little girl. I can't imagine I would be screaming at my little girl. And so I kind of just stepped back and started thinking about how I was treating really not just her, but the other kids in our family. And I realized that I guess I was kind of a screamer, right? And I realized she had learned it from me. And she had basically modeled my behavior. And so I was thinking, at that time, what else are my kids modeling from me? What other kind of situations are they learning from the way I act? And so it wasn't long after that, my 2 oldest sons were at the age where they're going to church every Wednesday night. And my oldest son says, "Dad, do we really have to go tonight? I mean, they're not going to do anything fun. It's just going to be a waste of our time. And I don't really see how we're getting any value out of it." And I said, "Yeah, you got to go. There's a couple things we do, right? And one is go to church on Sunday and one is go to church on Wednesday when we're supposed to." And so he wasn't very happy about it, but it kind of surprised me that he was defiant because he's not really a defiant type of kid. So I thought, where did he get that from? Where did the defiance come from? And then I started backtracking kind of um, some of the ways I had dealt with things in my life going to church, right? And one of them was there were some times when I had some leadership positions in our church, and I didn't want to go. I felt like it was a waste of time or it was a dumb meeting, and I would tell my wife, and I'm guessing it was in earshot of my boys. You know what? Do I really need to go to this meeting? I mean, I don't think I need to be there. I'm not going to add any value, and my wife would always say, "You know what? You need to go," and I would, right? And so I started to really think about how the things that we do and how we react to things, how we model certain behaviors for our kids. And so, I'm a big fan of modeling people. It's how I started my first business. It's how I had run a lot of parts of my life. But I didn't really realize the true impact that my own father and the way he modeled the way to live for me until at one point, I was talking to a friend of mine and he said, "Well, Kyle, who impacted you as a kid?" And I remember thinking about that long and hard because there wasn't a whole lot of people. I was a little bit of a defiant kid. I was kind of had a chip on my shoulder. I didn't really want to hear it from adults. And so, there was a big part of me that just wouldn't really listen to any adults. And, I said, "I'm not really sure." He said, "Do you have any teachers in school?" I said, "No, not really." "Do you have any coaches?" I said, "Well, yeah, but I mean, they coached me. I didn't really look up to them as people necessarily. I had coaches I liked, coaches I didn't like. I wouldn't say either of them had a bigger impact on my life long term." And he said, "Well, somebody's impacted you. I mean, you're a pretty happy-go-lucky guy. You're pretty friendly. Who did you model?" And it struck me that for years and years, I had basically, without even knowing it, developed a lot of the same personality traits as my father. I can remember as a kid, my father was in some positions of importance in our church. And I can remember him coming home after counseling people for hours and hours. And I could tell he was tired. And sometimes he'd come home, and I could tell there was a lot of stress involved in it too. He'd come home and he'd have a headache. And he would say, "You know what, Kyle, can you rub my head for me? I got a bad headache. If you'll rub my head, I'll give you a quarter." And at that time, a quarter wasn't that bad of a deal, right? And I can remember rubbing his head and goofing around with him. And he was always, even though I knew he was in pain and there was a lot of stress in his life, my dad always had a way of just kind of spewing happiness all over everybody he came across. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a little story about my dad. My dad passed away a few years ago. And at his funeral, my oldest brother, Curtis, was asked to give the eulogy. And as he was preparing the eulogy, it was one of my requests of my dad, "Can I do the eulogy?" And I didn't know it, but he was giving that honor to Curtis, my oldest brother. But I had basically written for my dad prior to him dying a eulogy about how important he was in our lives and some of the greatness things he had done. And I remember sitting at the airport as we were flying back to Dallas from Boise, Idaho, to go to his funeral. And I called my brother Curtis and I said, "How you doing?" Because he lived back in the Dallas area, and he was putting together the eulogy, and he said, "I'm doing okay, but I'm struggling with the eulogy." I said, "Well, you know what? I got some notes. Can I just send you my notes? Would that be helpful?" And he said, "Yeah." Well, as part of that, part of those notes was to ask those people that came to his funeral to share with us, his family that was there, how he had impacted their lives. And after the basically the ceremony was over, I was just approached by no less than, I mean, it was hundreds of people there, and many came up and talked about what a tremendous impact he'd had on their lives. As a matter of fact, while he was still alive, we have a unique last name. The last name is Jetzel, Jetsel, and it's not a widely used name, last name. I would have people come up to me, and I would tell them my name's Kyle Jetzel, and they would say, "Do you know Jerry?" I would say, "He's my dad," and then they would just gush all over me about how great of a man my dad was. So, the point is, my dad was a wonderful man, and he spewed happiness all over everywhere he went. And even though he had a difficult life, he never made a lot of money, there were some real trials in his life, he continually left a wake of happiness behind him. And until my friend asked me, "Who did you model?" I hadn't realized that for years and years on end, I had been modeling my own father, Jerry Jetzel, without me even knowing it. His impact, his influence, whether I liked it or not, had really changed me. And so, I want to talk a little bit about modeling and how we can model for our kids the kind of things that we want for them, the kind of behavior we want from them. We can even model for our spouses. I know I was a little bit aggressive and overbearing when I first got married to my wife, and she really has, through her behavior and the way she's modeled kindness and love and caring, has brought me closer to center, just because I've watched her and I've seen the way she's handled things. So I want to give you two kinds of examples here, and I want to start by just telling you kids can sniff out a hypocrite a mile away. At the beginning of this, I talked about how we're training our kids, even our wives. We're training those people around us. And the training we're giving them is the way we model the kind of behavior the kind of things we do and the kind of behavior we have and the kind of behavior we'll accept. And I want to challenge you, if you've ever said, don't, to your kids or anybody, don't do what I do what I say, and don't ask me any questions, I think it's short-sighted. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So a few years back, I was working for a company, and I happened to be working with a younger kid who had struggled. And growing up, he had been given a little bit too much freedom at a young age. About 14 or so, he'd been given way too much freedom, and he'd made some horrible decisions, and they had run him down a path that really got him in a lot of trouble. And when I started working with him, he was kind of working his way back into, I would call it normalcy, right? And so I had a chance to talk to him a little bit about what made him, or what led him to make those really difficult decisions that kind of ran him down a path that was real tricky. And over, he consistently told me, his mom and or his dad would say certain things, but they would act differently. And as he gave me example after example, I could tell that he had identified very quickly that his parents had become kind of hypocritical. They would tell him what they expected of him, but they would do something different. And the more stories and the more talking to I did, I'm a curious fellow. And so when I learn somebody has difficulties, I want to know how they got there and what happened and, what led to it and kind of how they were raised and all these different things. And over, he used the term hypocritical to describe the way he had been raised. And he told me story after story of situations where his parents would say one thing and do another. And over a period of time, he just said, "You know what? They're full of crap." And really, he lost they lost the ability to influence him in the guidance that he needed from his parents. Um, and so, to see him struggle and really go through those things was very difficult for me, but it also made me very aware of how we act and the things that we do say more than the things that we say to our kids and to our spouse. And that goes both ways, right? Um, and so just to contrast that, I want to kind of tell you a little bit about um, a trip we took as a family this past summer. So I have a big family. Like I said, I have 6 kids, so there's 8 of us total. And my wife and I decided to rent a big giant 15-passenger van and drive our kids to San Francisco. And part of that plan was to make sure they put up their devices as we drove. And so they couldn't look at the internet, and they could watch movies now and then, but I mean, we're talking about a 12-hour drive each way. And we were curious and wanted to really see how they would interact with each other and how they would, the kinds of things they would talk about. And it was really fascinating, the organic conversations that grew out of a family with 5 boys, my oldest son being about 25 at the time, and my daughter was 11, and she has a twin brother who's 11 as well. So you've got kids all through there. You've got 2 in the middle that are on the autism spectrum. There's just a lot going on, right? And so a lot of conversations were introduced, and most of it was just silliness. I mean, turns out without me knowing, they mooned some people down the freeway. I'm laughing because there was no harm done, but certainly I didn't. If I'd have known that was going to happen, I probably would have put an end to it. But and once we got to San Francisco, we did all the San Francisco stuff. We went to a San Francisco Giants baseball game. We drove over the Golden Gate Bridge. We took tours all over the city, and we even drove up the coast a little bit north. I think a little bit north up the coast to and found a beach to just sit on and have a lot of fun. But the most interesting thing and the most fascinating thing to me was on the way back. Some organic conversation started, and turns out my sons had decided the time was right to talk with Chloe, my daughter, about who she was going to date, and how they were going to protect her, and all these things, right? And it was interesting because she just patiently listened to my oldest son and my second oldest son, and then her twin brother, and they all gave her this advice on how to choose guys and what to watch out for and what some red flags were, and they were really giving her some interesting advice. But at the very end, she said something I thought was so profound. She said, "You know what? I'm just going to pick guys to date that are just like you guys, my brothers, because you treat me good, and that's what I want. I want somebody who'll treat me good and love me." And it was just overwhelming to hear that. My wife and I were sitting in the front seat, and we looked at each other. I mean, and as you can imagine, tears welled up in our eyes to think that she felt loved in that way by her brothers, and they treated her so good that that's how she wanted to be treated, and that's how she expected to be treated. And a little bit afterwards, I had a conversation with my wife about this, and we had this conversation, and my wife said, "You know what? I appreciate the way you treat me, and I appreciate the way you treat the kids, because they have expectations now. My daughter expects to be treated like you treat me, and that's good." And it was interesting to me because I'd never really thought about how the kids were modeling that, but my wife made it very clear that the greatest way to protect my daughter was for me to teach her how she should expect to be treated by the way I treated my wife and her mom, because she's watching. And that ability to model those things was really powerful for her. So I want to leave you with this. I just want to suggest to you that imagine your daughter grows up and the man she's with treats her the way you treat your wife. And focus on, how do you treat your wife? What do you say? What do you do? How do you treat her? And if that's the way you want your daughter to be treated when she grows up and by men, then you're doing okay. But if not, if you critically look at how you treat your wife and it's not the way you want your daughter to be treated, then you might want to reconsider how you treat your wife. And at the same time, you might want to start to reconsider how you talk to all your kids, and make sure that you're not one of those guys that says, hey, listen, don't do what I say. Don't do what I do. Just do what I say. That's the definition of a hypocrite, and your kids will see it, and you will lose the ability to influence them. So, at the beginning of this, I was very clear on what I wanted to say. We're training our kids, even our wives. My wife trained me on how to behave and how to act and how to treat other people. My suggestion is today to start treating them in the way that you want them to be treated, and model the kind of behavior you want for them. Model the kind of man you want your boys to become, and model the kind of husband you want your daughter to grow up to marry. And if you'll do that, I promise you, you're going to start seeing dramatic changes in the way your family works and loves and treats each other. So hopefully that's helpful. Listen, have a great day. Do your best. If things are hard, suck it up, work hard. Do your best to love your family, and if you will, I'm sure you'll be successful as well. Have a great day. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.